2014, so I'm so delighted we've got a long runway with you ahead. She oversees the bank's strategic planning, economic and financial research. She's a member of the bank's governing council. She oversees the bank's analysis of international economic developments in support of monetary policy here in Canada, and so many other things. She doesn't want me to go on and on. I do want to say, just reflecting on education, proud Ontario girl. She's got her honors BA in economics from Wilfrid Laurier University, and went a little bit further down the 401 to get her MA in economics at Western following that. She's also twice been named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women, and I know that run's likely to endure a very, very long time. She's got many more nominations to that rank as well. As a member of the bank's governing council, she's key to overseeing the bank's strategic planning and economic research. But rather than be stalled by the numbers or overwhelming amount of data, Carolyn focuses on people, how they're going to be affected by what's happening in the economy. We look to underemployment and labor force participation as important indicators to where our economy has room to grow. And she's going to talk us through those indicators. As I mentioned before lunch, following her remarks, she and I will have a wonderful fireside chat, and I'll be looking forward to receiving your questions through Slido, so please make sure you've got them activated. Without further ado, could you please join me in a very warm welcome to Bank of Canada Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn A.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's just great to be in Toronto. I always love coming here, and I'd like to thank the Toronto Region Board of Trade for the invitation. I think it's fair to say that 2019 has gotten off to a challenging start, and I'm just not talking about the weather here. You know, what's happening in the housing market here at home, oil prices, the trade conflict between the United States and China, and Brexit, well, they're top of mind for all of us. Canadians are going to be more confident in facing these challenges if they feel that they're secure in their jobs. And it's vital to your bottom lines as well as business people, because without good and secure, well-paying jobs, sooner or later the demand for your products and your services is going to suffer. For a central banker like me, the job market's a bellwether of financial health, and it's also a useful gauge of inflation pressures. By many measures, the labor market in Canada is in pretty good shape. The unemployment rate is at its lowest level in records going back 40 years. Firms across the country, and I really mean across the country, are telling us that it's difficult to fill job openings. And I suspect that many employers here in Toronto can relate to this. Now, these are signs of labor market strength, and certainly many are benefiting from the positive overall environment. Not everybody is, though. Recent layoffs in the auto sector have touched many families in this region, and there have been layoffs and closures elsewhere in the country. And moreover, wages overall in Canada are not rising as fast as we would expect, given how low unemployment is. So today what I'm going to do is look under the hood of Canada's labor market to answer three important questions. Well, how well is the job market really doing? If firms are finding it so hard to fill jobs, why don't they just offer higher wages? What structural factors could weigh on wage growth going forward? And the answers to these questions will help the Bank of Canada find the right path for interest rates to meet our inflation objective. But they'll also help businesses and governments develop strategies to boost Canada's prosperity over the longer term. Aujourd'hui, je vais regarder de près la performance du marché du travail canadien. Il est essentiel que la Banque du Canada comprenne bien ce qui se passe au niveau des emplois et des salaires pour mener une politique monétaire appropriée. Cette compréhension aiderait aussi les entreprises et les administrations publiques à élaborer des stratégies visant à favoriser la prospérité du Canada. So let's just start with some basic facts. Last year, the economy added 163,000 jobs, and all of them were full-time positions. The unemployment rate fell to 5.6%. That's a historic low. The participation rate for prime-age workers is around 87%. That's near its all-time high. And if that sounds positive, it's because it is. However, it does raise the question for the Bank of Canada of whether the job market is at a point where inflation pressures are starting to build. If you use the trend or natural rate of unemployment as a guide, that's just an economist measure of the rate of unemployment that neither puts upward nor downward pressure on inflation, well then at first glance the answer could in fact be yes. That's because our most recent staff analysis that we just published today puts Canada's natural rate of unemployment in the range of 5.5% and 6.5%. However, I think this conclusion that pressures are starting to build would be too hasty. Why is that? Well, the natural rate of unemployment is a bit like dark matter. I used that analogy a couple of years ago with the neutral rate, and I really think it's the same thing. The estimates are subject to a lot of uncertainty, and perhaps even more so than with other useful economic concepts like potential output. They also tend to move around as the structure of the economy changes, and you just look at the 1990s as an example. Estimates for that time put the natural rate of unemployment at around 9%, and it was brought down over time in large part by labor market reforms, although estimates that were made in real time only captured the changes with a lag. And this uncertainty means that it's imperative to look beyond such measures of full employment or maximum employment towards other indicators of labor market slack. And in this instance, the Bank of Canada has pointed to relatively subdued wage growth as a possible sign that the job market may have more room to run. And economic theory tells us that when the actual jobless rate is kind of near the natural rate, an economy is essentially at full employment. And at that point, what we'd expect is that wages would be rising at the same pace as the target rate of inflation plus the trend rate of productivity growth. And this is because the strongest underlying factors that determine worker pay in real terms are how productive the workers are and their value to an employer's production process. And we've just put something up on our website today as well in our part that's called Economy Plain and Simple, to try to help explain to people inside this room, people outside this room, of just what actually determines wages. So I encourage you to look at it. So for Canada, what this implies is that wage growth of around 3% is what you would expect, and that's just the sum of 2% inflation and 1% total trend of productivity growth. Well, wage growth has picked up considerably to average about 2.5% in 2018. And this compares with just around 2% over the past 5 years. But we're still shy of what one would expect in a tight labor market. The story is pretty similar in the U.S. as well. The U.S. jobless rate has been below 4% for quite a while now, and this is much lower than the estimate of the natural rate there, which is around 4.5%. Yet wage gains only rose to reach the sum of inflation and productivity there. And so it does raise the question of what's going on. Well, if we take it back to Canada, we can see that regional and sectoral factors can explain a lot of why wage growth has been so tame. The steep drop in oil prices that occurred in the second half of 2014 had an impact that rippled through Canada and is still being felt. And it's being felt across the country, but mostly in energy-intensive regions where wage gains continue to lag those in the rest of the country. And just to give you a sense about how big a deal this is, wage growth in the third quarter of 2018 was just under 2% in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, but it was about 3/4 of a percentage point higher in Ontario and Quebec. So closer to the 3% that one would expect in these other provinces. Now that divergence makes sense when you consider that investment in jobs and investment that businesses make in energy-intensive regions are going to respond to changes in oil prices. In fact, if we roll the history back a bit, there was a massive increase in employment in these regions from 2000 to the end of 2014, and that led wage growth there. So with much lower oil prices since 2015, employment in the oil and gas sector has fallen by about 20%. That's about 30,000 jobs. It's not insignificant for places like that. Other goods-producing sectors, though, like manufacturing and agriculture, are also becoming less prominent employers. Instead, there's a range of service sectors that have contributed to job growth, and exactly in the places that you'd expect, given longer-term trends. Digitalization has led to a burst of jobs in computer system design. It's up by about 40% over the last 5 years, and that's in Canada. We heard some numbers just for this region. But there's also been a boom in health-related jobs, particularly elder care. Now, almost all the jobs and services that have been created are full-time, and about 2/3 of them have been in industries that pay higher than average wages. Over the past year, in fact, service sector wage gains were much stronger than those in the goods sector. Yet, even when you account for these regional and sectoral factors, wage growth overall is still a bit short of what one would expect at this stage. And it's particularly puzzling when you consider what businesses are telling us about how hard it is to fill jobs. As firms in our latest Business Outlook survey reported one of the highest levels of labor shortages since the Great Recession. And job vacancies keep going up. Now they're totaling about 550,000. So if the right workers are so hard to attract, why not simply offer more money? Well, many firms are doing just that. However, other factors must be holding back wages or the national numbers would be higher. That's just arithmetic. As far as I can tell, no one has found a smoking gun, but there are at least a couple of compelling suspects. And the first is that it just may be difficult to find the right person for the job. Attracting the right talent is rarely just about the money. I can tell you in my business, it's not easy to find all the specialized talent that the Bank of Canada needs. And estimates for Canada suggest that about 1 in every 10 jobs is affected by mismatches between the skills that the job requires and the skills that workers actually have. The sectors with skills shortages shouldn't come as any surprise. They're in places like healthcare or the digital economy. Meanwhile, sectors like manufacturing and natural resources have a surplus of people with the required skills. A second suspect is a sense of caution. And what I mean by this is that people may be reluctant to search for a better job, even if they'd like one. And perhaps it's a case of the devil that you know. Maybe it's a case of the age distribution, people getting older, or it just could be remnants of the Great Recession, which touched a lot of people and not in a positive way. But the data bear this out. Turnover in Canada, in the Canadian job market, and this turnover is called job churn, is relatively low these days. Higher churn and turnover in jobs usually means higher wages, and that's because people that are willing to change jobs or trade up typically drive wage gains of the economy. Job churn is especially sluggish in oil-producing provinces, where wage gains have been most restrained. As a comparison, job churn in the United States recovered more quickly, in part because the oil price shock that we had in 2014 and 15 was actually a positive for the global expansion in the U.S., or for the U.S. expansion. And that churn has supported wage growth in the U.S. Another suspect for Canada is geography. Canada's a beautiful country, but its sheer size does not help. The data show that Canadians have become more open over the past decades to relocating for new opportunities, but still, it's no small thing to pull up stake and move to a new city or province, often far from friends and family. And if you're fortunate enough to find a job that's a good match for your skills and for your ambition, you still have to ask yourself, will the housing be affordable? Will the commute be a nightmare? Will my partner be able to find meaningful employment too? And I bet a few people in this room have had a prize candidate slip away once they realized that they couldn't afford GTA housing prices, or they weren't keen to spend hours commuting to work every day if they lived further out. Well, as expansion continues, history tells us that job churn is going to pick up as employment continues to grow, and this should lead to more employers finding it necessary and worth their while to offer higher wages. That all being said, some of the forces that have been weighing on wage growth are structural in nature, and that means that they're likely to persist. These forces aren't unique to Canada, and they're being felt in many advanced economies. Now, how innovation is playing out here in the global economy is front and center. The technological advances have lowered the demand for many types of routine jobs, and it's not just manual jobs, it's also cognitive jobs, and in all advanced economies, including Canada. And these losses have been more than offset by jobs in other sectors that are experiencing stronger employment and wage growth. High-tech workers are the most obvious example. At the same time, we have more and more workers who have to compete with people around the world as firms work to stay competitive in global markets. Another effect is the most recent wave of innovation is the rise of what is typically called a superstar firm. And these superstar firms are making the competitive landscape more challenging. The issues around market power are hardly new, but control of valuable consumer data, control of electronic platforms can act as modern impediments to competition. And when a few firms dominate an industry, or a firm becomes the only major employer in town, workers have little choice but to stay in their jobs regardless of wages or other labor conditions. And consequently, those firms may feel less pressure to raise wages for many of their workers, even as the job market tightens. It's not just digital firms. Concentration is growing across many industries in some countries, including Canada and the US. And because workers' wages haven't kept pace with gains in productivity over the last few decades, their share of income has fallen, particularly in the US, but also in Canada. The relationship between employers and workers has also changed over the years. We know that workers are making greater use of employment agencies and short-term contractors to replace salaried employees. Unionization rates in the private sector are down. And we hear from labor market experts that this has changed the social contract between companies and their workers. This is profound. The social contract is at the base. And so I think we really need to understand it better because it is at the base of any solid economy. The gig economy has also created a new set of jobs that reduces the bargaining power of workers as well. These non-standard jobs may have advantages, such as the ability to work as needed. A lot of people like that, and Uber drivers might be an example, or some of them. But many of these workers indicate that they'd prefer more stability. Not a lot of data on this, but the Bank of Canada just did a survey that found that roughly 1/3 of respondents were participating in some form of non-standard or gig employment, and for many it was as a side job to top up income. And these workers are more likely to be young and to live in provinces where the jobless rates are historically high. And by our count, there are the equivalent of 700,000 people in Canada who are doing non-standard work because of economic conditions and who would also rather be doing something more formal. To be sure, monetary policy can do very little to directly influence structural issues like the ones I've just talked about that are affecting the labor market and the wider economy. My job is to keep inflation low and stable so that people like you in the business community can operate in a predictable environment that supports sustainable economic growth. That said, there's considerable scope for other public policies and for businesses to enhance the long-term prosperity of workers. This is your customer base, and by extension, the economy. We all recognize the importance of investing heavily in the right skills for the digital economy and for other growing sectors like elder care services. And while governments may be on the front lines of this, businesses need to play a stronger role in partnering with schools and universities. We want more students to gain pertinent experience and to develop the kinds of relationships and the kind of state of mind that fosters entrepreneurship. In some ways, this has been happening for years. For instance, 2/3 of University of Waterloo students are in co-op placements with firms across Canada. That's just one example. I was in a co-op program myself at Wilfrid Laurier University back in the days when the earth was still cooling. So other schools, such as Carleton University, are expanding their links to locally based tech industry leaders, and this is great too. But it doesn't stop when you've made the hire. More businesses need to invest in their employees throughout their careers. Many tell us that's exactly what they're doing, through intensive in-house training. What's less prominent in these discussions about improving the job market is supporting labor mobility. This would help businesses attract the right people for the job, harness the national labor market. Now, affordable housing is front and center. I would just like to underscore that our view at the bank is to a large extent an issue of supply. It's also an issue of transportation infrastructure in major job markets, and it includes removing barriers to interprovincial trade. And finally, I'd just like to emphasize that we shouldn't forget that competitiveness of Canadian business is at the foundation of a robust job market. The tax changes that were made by the federal government last autumn are a positive step in this regard, and they should lead to more investment in capacity and productivity. A higher productivity would make it easier for wages to rise faster without inflation pressures. Strategies geared to developing and adopting new technologies in a data and digital-driven economy across all sectors would also be critical to our economic potential. So it's time to wrap up. Despite a challenging start to the year, the labor market in Canada is in a solid place overall. It is worth looking under the hood of the job market to better understand emerging inflation pressures and what strategies might add to Canada's prosperity. Some of the weakness in wage growth can be explained by the continued adjustment in energy-intensive regions to lower oil prices. There are also some structural factors, both inside and outside Canada, that may continue to weigh on overall wage growth. That said, we also need to be mindful of stronger wage gains and signs of labor shortages in other parts of the economy. Monetary policy has to be forward-looking. As you know from our latest outlook published a couple of weeks ago, the recent weakness in oil prices and softness in housing mean that we expect growth to slow temporarily. We expect the economic expansion to pick up again after this detour and in the second quarter of 2019, and this should lead to a pickup in wage growth as well. There are risks on both sides to this outlook, so we'll continue to pay close attention to wages and to other developments that are driving our projection for inflation. This includes how oil prices, the Canadian housing market, and global trade policy evolve. Rest assured that the bank will do its part to meet its inflation objectives. And as I've just discussed, businesses and governments can help build an even more vibrant job market by investing in education and training, by encouraging labor mobility, and by improving competitiveness of Canadian companies. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll get you on the far seat. I thought it was Terrific. A terrific set of remarks that really just sums up everything we're facing. We absolutely agree. Big, beautiful country and too few people to work across it. I, in fact, just came back from Ottawa. We're part of a group called the Canadian Global Cities Council, where the 8 large metros, the boards of trade, work together. And so a lot of our discussion while we were there was about the challenges across the country related to labor. You touched on housing. In Vancouver, they've got severe shortages of teachers and of service staff, because housing affordability just means there's just no choice about moving into that market. Halifax has an aging workforce, and so they're desperate for more talent to come into that market to replace retirees that are exiting the workforce. My counterpart in Halifax was actually, and I'd like your impression on this, was actually, they're starting to have discussion now about, do they offer incentives? $1,000 for a plot of land if you move to Halifax and take a job. So something like that as an incentive to say, forge a new life here. Montreal's got very active programs with immigrants that are coming in, looking at getting them quickly certified for that market, but then having employers in Montreal hire them for other parts of the province, jobs in other parts where they've got high demand for talent but can't attract people into those locations. And here in Toronto, an interesting stat, Neptus Foundation just released a report looking at our mega zones for employment. In addition to downtown, there's 3 other zones. But over the last 6 years, we've seen job loss in those other zones and hyper concentration of talent coming into Toronto. So last year, there were 46,000 new jobs created in Toronto region. 30,000 of those were downtown Toronto. So huge concentration because people don't want the transit problem. So lots that's so interconnected with this labor challenge, and it's great that you're deep diving on this. And I'm waiting for some Slido questions to come. I'm not seeing anything at the moment on our screen. So have you been asking some questions, or I'll introduce some questions? Okay.
I didn't think people in Toronto were so shy.
I didn't think so either. Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening. It could be that my, just want to look at one of the team.
Well, why don't I answer your question about Halifax and having these incentives? It's interesting because I focused quite a lot on the wage part of the job proposition. And in fact, that's only one part of it when you think about how attractive the job is and what employers are willing to do. And when you talk to people across Canada, many of the initiatives they're taking are not so much on the wage side, because you need to do that for everybody in your establishment. There's some salary inversion that happens, but it's rare. And so they're doing it in the other side, thinking about subsidizing housing, having an ability to telework and do 1 day at home. And I think those are the kinds of innovative labor market, job market practices that especially the younger generation appreciate. And so there's more margins to maneuver than just salary, and some employers are taking advantage of that.
Great. Why don't I take a question from the floor while Andrew's fixing technology for us? Thank you. Yep.
That's an excellent question, because that's part of that global labor market that seems to have emerged, especially in some areas, because you can move parts. Technological advances allow you to move parts of your production chain to other countries, and sometimes very quickly, especially if it's a service rather than you move capital and very few people. So there is that going on. The devil is in the details when you try to figure out how important is that relative to other factors. And so when you look at the economic studies, you may often, in particular for Canada, not really pick up anything in the data. So it's a bit frustrating in that dimension. But we know when we talk to companies that this is exactly what's happening. I think the issue, and in fact there was a really good article in the Globe and Mail about data on the weekend, is that if you want to understand the changing ecosystem and the changing tissue of the labor market, but also the economy, I think we're going to have to find renewed ways in terms of measurement, but also in data collection, because we just wouldn't have the information we need to really study it as seriously as we'd like to.
Yeah, thanks. And Fido's working, so thanks, Carolyn. Really good tap dance with me there. Thank you. I appreciate that. But one of the questions that really interests me, and it connects to what I was just talking about across Canada, is how uneven our regional economies are. And I know Richard Florida has spoken more than once that when this Amazon HQ2 bid was going on, his forecast is that's probably the last time you're going to see a big headquarter like that move to a major center because of all the competition for land and access to talent. So does the Bank of Canada have any perspective on what we can be doing to smooth our economy out across regions rather than having so many areas of hyper-concentration and shortages?
Yeah. So you know that when you target inflation, you need to look at the macroeconomy, and certainly looking at a regional level and a sectoral level helps us understand where there may be more inflation pressure than others and use our judgment to figure out how we should take that on board. At the same time, how robust an economy's financial system is and its growth is also depends on how well different regions can absorb shocks, we call them, but events that basically cause a downturn. And you're right, in Canada, energy prices going up is usually good for certain regions and not so much for others because of the exchange rate. So one of the things that I don't think we've changed our mind on over all these years is the floating exchange rate really does act as a solid buffer. At the same time, if you want to have less of a divergence, then really this idea of diversification, which could come from not only trade with people south of the border, but trade within Canada, could really be something that would be helpful for all regions.
Looking at the tech sector and AI, how worried are you about the impact that AI is going to have to jobs in Canada?
I think the only game in town is productivity growth if you want to raise the standard of living of your population. And we've seen with other technological changes that what they do is they increase employment overall, and they increase income of a country overall. And the question is really, how do you manage the transition and manage it seriously? This is not an easy task. I don't think any country would say that they've nailed it on how to deal with displaced workers or really implement this lifelong learning that's required to buffer that. And at the same time, I think with many ways of innovation, there's the part where it's the result of a lot of competition. And then after that, when you have maybe what you might call natural monopolies or natural concentration that comes out of it. We saw that in the Teddy Roosevelt era with the railways. We've seen it at other times. You do end up with really big companies that may actually be barriers to competition in the future. And when that happens, I think, from a productivity point of view, it's not good, but from a distribution of those gains that don't necessarily trickle down, it's not good news either. And so I think the frontier really to work on is how to ensure that people are included in the productivity gains more than they have been, and also how do you ensure that we have really vibrant competition.
And I would say the other thing we're spending a lot of time discussing with our members, and we've taken a look, Moretti had written a book in the U.S. called The New Geography of Jobs. And the thesis there was in these innovation centers, it's critical because there's hyper job growth. For every one tech job, there's 5 service or other related jobs that are created, and they tend to pay higher in markets that don't have innovation. And I know as we look at some of the challenges we've got here in Toronto with lack of sufficient transit, lack of sufficient housing, we've got lots of infrastructure dollars coming in to invest in this, but our construction sector is saying we don't have the talent to get it built. So 146,000 jobs over the next decade is our estimate
of new jobs being created in Toronto in construction and in professional services related to transportation and infrastructure projects. And so part of the onus comes back on organizations like ours to work with our members to start quantifying where the job demand is, working with post-secondary to create capacity, and helping households understand choices as they're going through moving things forward. But it's overwhelming to start trying to think about how do you do that sector by sector. Is there anything you're aware of from a data source that we could be using to plug into something like that?
No, there's one thing that comes to mind when you think about how well Canada can expect to do because of this, and clearly having a competitive strategy is one of them. But it's also about how and this is not a central banking job, so I'm just telling you what I'm reading from the studies, not how policy should really do anything. But it's really important to diffuse the technology and adopt it. And so if you look at why Canadian firms are overall less productive than U.S. firms, there's a great study by Tefler, I think, that did that. I could have the name wrong. And others have shown this too, it is really a function of the fact that firms tend to be smaller in Canada, and then on top of that, they also don't tend to adopt the technology as much as U.S. firms do. And understanding what are those impediments to firms actually taking this new technology on, having that new inventory process, or harnessing AI to help them out with their internal audit, or whatever it happens to be, whatever the right fit is. I think that kind of effort means that those gains are spread not only across those who are in the industry, but all firms. Because I don't think there is a technology and digitalization is about a sector. It's about the whole economy.
Yeah. Looking internationally as that pertains to the impact for Canada's economy, 2019-2020, we've got friction in our efforts with a trade relationship with China. We've got a situation in the U.S. We don't know whether the new agreement will be signed or not. There's still a tariff situation we're dealing with. Brexit, it has huge implications for some of our financial services firms. What does 2019-2020 look like for Canada?
That's a lot of uncertainty, and the uncertainties on both sides from that point of view. Like one of the interesting things about our positioning today is that the economy is operating pretty much at full capacity, and the labor market is in good shape, and so the starting point, financial institutions are well capitalized and have good liquidity. Now there is a lot of household debt, which is a cloud on that. We're starting from a position that could be worse, and I think it's positive. This uncertainty, if you just tackle the trade side, I think with respect to U.S. and China, it could go either way, and we worry a lot about the downside, and we've mentioned that in the monetary policy report a number of times. We've taken some of that uncertainty on board with our forecast. But when you're doing monetary policy, you need to think about, well, what could the risk be on the other side? And I believe that the incentives are there. The opportunity may not be, but to get a deal for the U.S. and for China because of where they are in their economic cycle and the costs that we already see being borne by those countries in terms of lower trade and higher costs that will only be a further weight on their economic growth. So we could see resolution. We didn't think we'd see any resolution to NAFTA, and we did. And so it's a possibility. We've taken on board the USMCA being adopted, and that means that we've been able to take off some of the uncertainty there. There's possibilities that won't happen. We're not going to try to call that. That would be speculation. And either way, we'll integrate what it is into our forecast. When those are the things, I think that you should pull yourself out of 2019 and 2020. The thing that worries me is not the next business cycle. It's where are we going to be in terms of multilateralism and the support that we've had for so many years for international supply chains in production that have had amazing impact across the world in terms of living raising people out of poverty, increasing productivity here, and I just think about the longer term costs and our potential to grow at a time when we're not going to have growth in our population except through immigration. I just think those are longer term costs, and so the hope is that whatever China and the U.S. do has some positive impact in terms of how to renew the WTO, just as an example, in its number of dimensions. Mm-hmm. And so we should be looking past the next 2 years and really seeing how we can contribute to a more positive dialogue on the globalization and multilateral front.
Yeah. There's a lot of discussion globally and here in Canada about the widening income gap. And it was interesting in your remarks when you were talking about we've got such low churn, and is there conservatism or a risk aversion about going after those other jobs as one way of triggering higher wages? How does the widening income gap figure into fiscal policy in Canada?
I'm not going to answer a question about fiscal policy,
okay.
Because we all know what the options are in that regard. So I think just to get the facts right, it's interesting when you look at the changes in the share of income for Canada. The big changes actually occurred over the 90s. They haven't occurred recently. It's actually been pretty flat. You need to look. I can see some people at the table over there going, it depends what measure you look at. So devils are in the details. What I would say is a big deterioration in the U.S. And some other G7 countries that Canada hasn't seen. And part of that maybe, and there was a report that came out just today, I haven't been able to go through all of it, the tax systems are different across different countries, across different provinces, and they'll have differential effects on offsetting some of these widening gaps. But more generally, people don't see themselves benefiting from globalization. In fact, they may think that it's actually exactly the opposite. And so until that changes at the voter level, at the individual level, it's going to be a difficult road. Just aside from the fact that it's very difficult to create agreements across so many countries. I worked on the liquidity arrangements for the Basel III with 49 people around the table. We finally got liquidity requirements that some of you, I know you must love them, the LCR and the NSFR, and that was much simpler than what needs to be achieved at the WTO.
Let's switch domestically again, looking at housing supply. And we absolutely agree with your statement that it's a supply issue, we believe, more so than a demand issue. There's lots of reports at the moment about a cooling housing market in GTHA and Vancouver, which I think is more about number of transactions rather than lack of demand for housing. Any take on what's happening in those two markets relative to housing?
I guess my take would be that you need to back up and see where those two markets came from and the price growth, not over the last year, but over the last 5 years. And when you have housing markets that have grown so strongly and prices that are still, in the double digits, well into the double digits, higher than they were, say, 5 years ago, you would expect, given the fact that B20 has come in with the stress test, that we've raised interest rates a number of times, and then in some markets, and in particular in Vancouver, which is really showing some weakness still, had tax changes at the municipal and provincial level. And so there's been a lot of policy actions that have interacted with each other and piled on, which is what we're looking at now. We thought that the housing market would have stabilized a little bit earlier than it seems to, and that's why we talk about it being one of the things we're looking at. When you look at where the fundamental demand is going to be, say for Toronto, with immigration, a lot of the job growth being here, there's definitely a lot of support, and so we're gonna see that stabilize, and we're seeing signs of it already. There's a shift in the composition though, from building big single family homes to smaller multiples, and that may be the same numbers of houses that are being built, but in value terms, what's going to show up in the national accounts, it's going to be a drag.
Yeah. And another question we had was about rising household debt. And I know with interest rates at the moment appearing to be in a pause in terms of not a lot of acceleration, but household debt also is keenly reflected in young professionals in Toronto who are saying they're coming out with student debt, trying to get into the housing market, and just feeling that that's not going to set them up on a path for financial success, not even being able to contemplate retirement planning at some point down the road. So what is the view at all, what is the view at the Bank of Canada regarding the level of household debt and what options need to be considered in terms of either keeping it in check or helping to create solutions?
So clearly the strong rise in household debt and the fact that it's so high as a share of disposable income is a concern, and it's a concern because it means that a lot of households are less resilient to things that undermine their financial situation, either losing a job or having more interest rate payments on their mortgage or whatever might happen to them. And so the fact that it's stabilized, it started to edge down, and the quality of new debt, these young people or other people buying houses in Toronto in particular, are no longer as highly levered as they used to be. I mean, there's a huge percentage, 20% or something of the new loans in some of the spaces in Toronto were to people who were indebted to 450% and more of their income, and that's come down quite a lot. It's that new loans it's under 10% now. So the quality of debt underneath is pretty is getting better. It's going to take a lot of time for it to be totally resolved. You asked what can people do. I think those are individual decisions between them and their families and their banker. But it does raise the question about affordability of housing, and not just housing that you purchase, but the affordability and quality of housing that you might rent. Different global cities, and that's what Toronto has become, Vancouver too, have a mix of home ownership and rentals, and having that kind of housing that is high quality is probably becoming of more importance than it was in the past.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. So great to have you here. Another round of applause for our Senior Deputy Governor. Thank you.
Pleasure.